Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. What's the creepiest paranormal activity you ever encountered? Story 1. Never sleep in a haunted basement.
A couple of friends and one attractive roommate rented a house in the next city over. It was a single-story house with a partially finished basement. The owner had started renovations but never completed them. Only the outer walls and one interior room were constructed. The main area of the basement was open with a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, and there was a scattering of old furniture around. My friends often used the basement for hosting parties. There was an unspoken request not to sleep down there, a detail I unfortunately did not hear. At the time, we were around 20 or 21 years old. After one party, people started finding spots to sleep wherever they could. I picked the only open space I could find, a worn-out couch in the basement. I woke up after only a few hours, around 4 or 5 a.m., to the sound of a man and woman whispering and giggling from the partially built room nearby. It sounded like it was someone from the party, so I got up to ask them to keep it down. However, as soon as I approached the doorway, the whispering stopped. It felt strange, but I convinced myself it might have been noise from the people still partying upstairs, and that it just sounded muffled through the floor. Since it did not start back up, I decided to ignore it and try to go back to sleep. I laid back down on the couch. The bright light bulb above was shining in my face, but I could not figure out how to turn it off. So I closed my eyes and tried to fall asleep regardless. While lying there with my eyes closed, I distinctly saw a shadow move across my eyelids, as though something passed between me and the light. That was it for me. I bolted upright and muttered, "Nope, nope, nope," repeatedly as I began walking toward the stairs. The cement floor was uneven, so some of my footsteps made scuffing noises. But then I realized I was still hearing the scuffing sounds, even when my shoes were not scraping the ground. I froze at the bottom of the stairs and listened intently. The shuffling footsteps continued, so I sprinted up the stairs, pausing one last time at the top to look back. There was nothing. I expected to see someone following, but the space was empty. I waited about 10 seconds, holding my breath, when suddenly I heard a single creak on the wooden bottom step. I quickly shut the door behind me and backed away, staring at it. Nothing came through. At this point, I was desperate to find one of my friends who rented the house, but I did not want to wake anyone. I finally found the roommate sleeping on an air mattress in the living room. A bit strange, but I did not question it. I gently shook her awake, saying, "Cece, wake up. Your basement is haunted." She looked at me groggily, like I was overreacting, and replied, "Of course. We told everyone not to sleep down there." All I could say was, "Oh, so can I crash on the corner of the air mattress?" She agreed. The next day, I heard all the ghost stories about the house from my friends. Apparently, the entire house had a haunted reputation, with the basement being the most active and unsettling part of it.
Story 2. Silent Watcher in the Corner.
A bit of background. When my wife was a child, her family lived with one set of her grandparents. Tragically, her grandfather was murdered in the home, specifically in his upstairs bedroom. After his death, the room was primarily used for storage for over 20 years. despite multiple attempts to sell the house. Living in a small town where everyone knew the tragic history made it nearly impossible. As a result, the family stayed. Years later, while my wife and I were engaged, there was a murder trial. I attended in support of her family and saw the crime scene photos, something that would come back to haunt me later. Fast forward a few years. My wife and I were married with 2 children, the oldest being 6 at the time. My wife's family avoided talking about the murder, and even today, our children are unaware of what happened in that house. One year, my father-in-law decided to repurpose the room where the murder occurred. He wanted it to be a fun hangout spot for the grandchildren during a family holiday gathering. He set it up with sleeping bags and a television. While my wife and I felt uneasy about it, we chose not to object out of respect for the family, as the topic was sensitive. My father-in-law also planned for all the grandchildren to sleep there together. We were the first to arrive at the house, and our 6-year-old son wandered into the room alone. He was typically very active at that age. So when I noticed he had been in the room for a couple of hours, I decided to check on him. The conversation that followed left me shaken. I walked into the room and found him sitting rigidly, staring intently at the television. "Hey buddy, is everything okay up here?" "Yeah." "All right, have fun." "Daddy, do I have to sleep in here?" "I don't want to." "Why not?" "I'm not alone." Every hair on my body stood on end. "Well, yeah, I'm here with you, buddy." "No, there is someone else in here with us." Trying to stay calm, I continued asking questions. "Are they nice? Mean? A grown-up? A kid? A grown-up? What are they doing right now?" "They're watching you." At this point, I was frozen trying to process his words. "You've never said anything like this at your grandparents' house before, and you've been here a lot. They don't leave this room, and I've never been in here before. Where are they now?" Without looking away from the television, he raised his hand and pointed directly to the far corner of the room, the exact spot where his great-grandfather was murdered. "They're standing over there. They don't move much." That was it. I said, "Okay, buddy, you don't have to stay in here," and quickly led him out of the room. To this day, I cannot explain what happened, and we avoid bringing up the incident with him.
Story 3. Ghost Boy.
It was the middle of winter when I found myself babysitting for a single mother and her 2 young daughters. I arrived around 6 p.m., and the darkness of the night had already settled over the small duplex. The cold wind howled outside, and I could feel the chill seep into the house as I entered. While I was standing in the living room with the mother and her daughters, discussing the plan for the night, something strange happened. A little boy, dressed head to toe in thick snow gear, suddenly walked in through the front door. He stomped his way through the living room, past the 3 of us, and headed straight for the stairs that led to the basement. The most unsettling part of it all was that the mother didn't even glance at him. She continued talking, as if nothing had happened. The 2 girls who had been playing just moments before didn't acknowledge his presence at all. It was as if they couldn't see him. I stood there, frozen with confusion, trying to process what I had just witnessed. But being a shy, introverted teenager, I didn't ask the mother about it. I simply dismissed it in my mind. though it was hard to ignore the eerie feeling that washed over me. Later, after the mother had left, I couldn't shake the thought of the boy. I nervously approached the girls and asked, "Who was the little boy that came in earlier?" They both looked at me like I was crazy, insisting they had no idea what I was talking about. I felt a wave of unease flood over me, and I gathered up the courage to go investigate. Grabbing a broom for comfort, I made my way down to the basement. It was a small, unfinished room, barely big enough to move around in. No closets, no hiding spots, just cold, bare walls and a floor covered in dust. I scanned the room, my heart racing, but there was no sign of the boy. I checked every corner, convinced he must have been hiding somewhere. But he hadn't come back upstairs and I was alone. At that moment, I knew something wasn't right. I had never believed in ghosts or paranormal activity before, but that night, I couldn't ignore what I had seen. It was the only time in my life that I truly believed I had experienced something supernatural.
Story 4. Haunted by the Banshee.
I was walking home one night from my grandmother's house. We lived in a village in rural Ireland. Granny's house was on the outskirts of the village, so I had to walk up a narrow country lane to get to her house, and then walk back down the lane towards the village. My grandfather was dying, and the priest had given him his last rites. He had pulled through that night, and my grandmother told me to go home and get some rest. I reluctantly agreed and began my walk home. I had walked down that same country lane since I was a boy. However, on this night, something felt different. It was almost as if the atmosphere had become strange and eerie, and I never get spooked. I tried to push the feeling aside, as my mind was still in shock over my grandfather's condition. As I walked towards the bottom of the lane, I noticed a blur of white near the farmer's gate to the field next to my grandparents' house. I assumed it was a lamb that had escaped, as that had happened before. I walked toward it to investigate. The moment I got closer, it felt as though electricity surged through my body. Every hair on my arms and what was left of my hair stood up in fear. I froze, paralyzed by a deep sense of dread. The figure before me was that of an old, hunched woman in a white robe. She let out the most agonizing scream, one so horrifying that I stopped breathing in sheer terror. It was a gut-wrenching cry, like the cry of a mother mourning the death of her child. It was the most terrifying sound I have ever heard. Adrenaline must have kicked in, because I immediately turned and ran back up the lane, toward my grandmother's house, rushing through the front door. I could hear my grandmother rushing out of my grandfather's room, crying. She said, "Granddad's gone." It was as though he had passed away in the 5 minutes I had spent walking down the lane and encountering the woman. I told my elderly aunt and other family members about the woman, and they explained that she was a friend of the family. They said she only appears when someone is about to die. At first I thought they were joking, but then my father, a man who was a born skeptic and very religious, confirmed the woman's existence. In some families in Ireland, she is known as the Banshee.
Story 5. Vanishing Stranger.
I'll take some time to type this. It's a little long, but it still scares me every time I think about it, and I still can't comprehend it. When I lived in Oregon, I worked in IT for the community college. I wasn't getting out until 9 or 10 p.m. by myself. It was a normal day, like any other. By the time I left work, it was pitch black, and the thick underbrush made it even harder to see. I drove through town and finally got to the highway that led from Lincoln City to Corvallis, which was a long stretch of empty highway that ran for over an hour through the forest. After about 45 minutes, I got to the hill that split into 2 lanes on both sides. As I accelerated in my tiny car, I noticed something moving alongside the guardrail. Okay, I thought, it's a deer, no big deal, just slow down and avoid it. I was extra careful because the thick underbrush meant each side of the road would be a deep well of blackness that could have any little critters hiding there, waiting to jump into my windshield. Well, before I could finish that thought, I saw feet. If you're from Oregon, you know the homeless situation is abysmal. It wouldn't be too strange for one of them to be hitchhiking out here, but it was definitely out of sorts this late at night. I decelerated to about 65 miles per hour. I was going 70, and kept an eye on those white shoes walking up the road. By the time I actually realized those were legs and shoes, the man darted out in front of my car in what I thought was a suicide attempt. I slammed on the brakes, trying to avoid him, and ended up sliding sideways, going 60 miles per hour in the opposite lane while the man ran out in front of me relentlessly. All I could see was his red plaid shirt and his body as he hit the hood of my car. When I came to a stop, he was leaning on the hood, staring directly at me. The primal fear I felt was something I didn't even know existed. The high beams of my car didn't even pierce whatever this man was. It was the blackest shadow, a void. Then, in an instant, he vanished, gone. I was breathless, absolutely breathless, shaking, thinking I had killed someone. I sat in the opposite lane, sideways, breathing heavily for a minute or 2. I couldn't help but scream at that point and pound on my accelerator to get out of there. I called my husband, screaming and crying that I just killed a man, but that he disappeared, and I didn't know what was happening. I left the scene, I know, illegal. By the time I got home 30 minutes later, I was still shaking. I got out of my car and ran to the hood, seeing no dents, no handprints, nothing. I didn't sleep that night. Here's where it got more unsettling. The next day at work, I researched deaths on that highway and found that a man rolled his truck with his wife and child inside. All 3 died. I highlighted his name and input it into Facebook. The first profile that came up was a memorial for that man. In his profile photo, he wore a red plaid shirt. I returned a few weeks later. In that same area where my skid marks were, there was the guardrail. Tied to that guardrail was, and probably still is, a moldy child's toy, a rabbit. Something is deeply, deeply haunted about that highway. I'm just glad there wasn't anyone in the oncoming lane, or I too would have been trapped there along with that man, whoever he was.
Story 6. Lady in White.
My ex-husband's family owns a massive farmhouse that was built in the late 1800s and has been passed down through generations. They inherited it from a pair of bachelor brothers and their sister, Aunt Kate. The story goes that she died in the attic, and that's why you often hear pacing up there at night. Aunt Kate is also known to take things like my ex-mother-in-law's jewelry and move it around the house. The music room in the house used to be used as the funeral parlor for that area back in the day. The house has the original furnace in the basement, which looked big enough to burn bodies. One time I came home and noticed my cat was halfway off the ottoman, kneading with his paws as though something unseen was petting him and holding the front half of him. I went over and ran my hand under him, but not touching him, and he immediately fell down. One night, my ex-husband was woken up by a lady in white standing over him, staring down at him. My ex is an electrician and a farmer, so he would never make anything like that up. Aunt Kate's room, where she once lived, is freezing cold all year round. There is no air conditioning. Yet it gets hot and humid in that house. One time I slept in there and had 7 quilts on in the middle of summer. I went to bed with the door closed, and the door and the wooden floor squeak loudly when they open. In the middle of the night, I woke up feeling hands going up and down my sides, tucking the blankets in like you would do for a child. I opened my eyes, terrified, but there was nothing there. The door was also open, which would have woken me up from the loud squeak. My ex remarried and had a daughter who has always seen an old man in overalls at the top of the stairs. He doesn't want her to go up. She's 10 now and has seen him constantly since she was little.
Story 7. Watched me in the night.
While at university, I lived directly next to a purportedly haunted cemetery in what is considered one of the most haunted cities in the country. The odd part about my living situation was that the basement apartment I stayed in was uniquely below the cemetery, so you could see tombstones at about eye level from the windows. One night during the winter, I woke up freezing cold as my sheet had fallen off of my futon. I was sleeping on the floor. I rolled over to grab it and realized that there was a man standing and looking out of the window not 4 feet away from me. I could see details of his face clearly, as there was a floodlight through the slats of my blinds, ear glasses, a mustache, and appeared to be in his mid-40s. I'm not sure why, but this didn't freak me out, and I must have chalked it up to thinking I was dreaming. I grabbed the sheet and went back to sleep without a thought. A few hours later, I woke up again to find my sheet missing. This time it was about 30 feet away in my kitchen, which is visible from where I sleep. The man was now standing and staring the opposite way towards the cemetery, and this time I really paid attention. I sat up and said hello, but there was no response. After staring at him, standing there for what seemed to be minutes, he moved out of sight in a very odd manner, which could only be described as sliding on ice. Half an hour of sitting and staring and saying hello to the room. I finally mustered up the courage to flip on my lights and go to the kitchen to retrieve my sheet, to confirm that, yep, nobody was in the apartment with me. The entire situation was bizarrely serene. I didn't feel any fear at all, just confusion.
Story 8. Crying Woman.
Before this incident, I never believed in the paranormal, but this event completely changed my perspective. My partner and I traveled to Edinburgh for a week-long holiday. Our first night there, my partner eagerly signed us up for a spooky walking tour that included a visit to the infamous Edinburgh vaults. The group was small, with only about 8 people, and my partner, who loves all things spooky, was thrilled. As for me, I wasn't particularly excited about ghosts, but the idea of sightseeing intrigued me, so I decided to go along. Our tour guide led us through the cobbled streets of Old Town, sharing chilling stories of the city's haunted past. We walked deeper into the old city, heading toward the vault. As we descended into the dark, damp chambers, a sense of eeriness surrounded us. The air was thick with history, and the silence was oppressive, making it the perfect atmosphere for a haunted tour. Then we entered the penultimate room, and something changed. The temperature dropped suddenly, sending a chill through my body. I started shaking uncontrollably, and out of nowhere, an overwhelming wave of emotion hit me. Tears welled up in my eyes for no apparent reason, and I began crying. I had no explanation for it, but the sorrow was so deep, it felt almost unbearable. Our guide explained that this was the room where a young woman had been seen many times. She had given birth to a stillborn child in this very spot, and her spirit remained to share her grief with anyone who entered. The room seemed heavy with sadness, and I could feel the weight of her sorrow pressing down on me. I knew I had to leave. I asked the guide to take me out, and he led me back up to the street level, away from the haunting atmosphere. My partner stayed behind, and the guide mentioned that the spirit here was often aggressive and that this emotional reaction was common. As I waited, trying to calm down, I was left with a sense of dread. When my partner returned a few minutes later, they told me that they had ventured into another room, where another ghost was rumored to haunt. But this time, something chilling had happened. They had literally walked into the spirit. Both of us were shaken, but after a drink at a local pub, we tried to shake off the experience. Despite our best efforts to laugh it off, we both knew that something real had happened. We left Edinburgh with our eyes open to the unexplainable, forever changed by that eerie encounter.
Story 9. Eerie secrets of our abandoned plantation house.
I have a haunted house in South Carolina. It's an old plantation house that is abandoned now, but we still own it. One time we heard something jump off of a bed upstairs and footsteps immediately after. The sound was like that of a dog, but the only dog in the house was right next to my feet. The sound repeated every 10 minutes or so for at least an hour. The sound only stopped after I checked the room. Another time I was home alone and heard a loud crash, like something had been smashed. I ran to the dining room, where I heard the noise and found that the giant painting above the fireplace was on the ground, shattered. However, the giant nail holding the painting in place was still there at an upward angle. The string to the painting was still intact. The only way that painting could have fallen was if something had picked it up and smashed it. Thinking there might be someone in the house, I called the police. A former football player turned South Carolina state trooper showed up, a tough man with nerves of steel. He searched the house with me, gun drawn, but was visibly shaking. He dropped his gun twice. He left shortly afterward, having found no one, and sped off down the driveway. Another time I was lying in bed sick, and there is a closet with an old door handle. The door is really hard to open. It has a giant latch, and the wood grinds against the floor. I was lying in bed when I heard the handle start to turn. The door opened just a crack, but it opened. I don't know how it happened, but it did. I ignored it and went to bed, thinking I was just having a crazy dream due to being sick. When I woke up, though, the door was still open. The next day, still in bed sick, I vividly remember my right hand trying to strangle me. It sounds crazy, but my right hand was choking me, and I couldn't stop it. I had to use my left hand to stop myself. Eventually, I regained control of my right arm and hand, but I never forgot what happened. This all happened in the master bedroom. On another occasion, I saw a young girl walking the halls. She was wearing a blue dress and had blonde hair. She didn't do anything to me, didn't scare me, she was just there. She disappeared after walking into the green room, a room with green walls. This house has about 5 living rooms. There's also a graveyard next to the property. Over time, the land was sold off, so we don't actually own the graveyard anymore. There are graves there dating back to the 1700s, including the grave of a baby. These are likely the original owners of the house. We also had an unsettling encounter with a neighbor on 4th of July. His name was Willie. How do I know this? He came to our front porch one time, shirtless, to introduce himself. He had a giant scar on his back. He asked us to make sure to put away the lawnmower because people might try to steal it. The lawnmower was hidden on the other side of the property, so the only way he could have known we had one was if he was wandering our property. Anyway, Willie shot at us, barely missing my brother in the head. His house burned down shortly afterward, with him inside. We don't go back there anymore.
Story 10. Knocking on the door.
For as long as I can remember, I've seen shadows and heard creaking, closing doors, misplaced items, and other unexplainable things throughout my childhood home. I've always watched horror movies and scared myself by reading creepypasta stories, which means I had several different escape routes planned out depending on where the person who was obviously going to come for me tried to get in. One day when I was in high school, I was home alone after school, sitting in the living room watching TV. From the mudroom that connected the living room to the garage, I heard a loud bang, like someone smashing their fist against the door connecting the garage and mudroom. I ran up to the kitchen with my phone, grabbed a knife, and peeked over the counter out the window towards the front of the house. No one was outside, no cars, and the garage door was still closed, meaning no one got into the garage, and no wind slammed the door. I eventually talked myself out of the whole serial killer thing, but I haven't been able to explain it, and it hasn't happened again. On a different night, my parents were gone when I went to sleep. I woke up to knocking on my bedroom door. My parents wouldn't have knocked to check in on me while I was sleeping. Without access to a weapon, I froze, because obviously this time it's going to be the serial killer, and just laid there for 10 minutes. I never heard any footsteps, nothing. I got up and went to my parents' room, and they were both fast asleep. So it's not even like they had just come home when I heard the knocking. On another day, I set a water bottle on the kitchen counter and continued walking towards the hallway. A couple of seconds later, I heard the bottle fall. But when I got back into the kitchen, the bottle was across the room. Yet another day, I was home alone in the living room when I heard a sneeze from back towards the bedrooms. My first instinct was to say bless you. My second thought was, didn't my boyfriend leave 30 minutes ago? During college, I came home for a break. I had to sleep in a loft bed, and I brought my sister's dog up with me because she liked to cuddle. I was woken up by both the feeling and sound of someone climbing up the ladder, which I was very familiar with at that time. I could feel my sister's dog against my leg, laying between me and the edge, when I felt something pet down the blanket, like they were petting the dog. I must have moved, because the dog realized I was awake and immediately turned around to jump onto my chest with her ears down, shaking. The intensity of events has toned down quite a bit, but for a stretch of time, something wanted to make itself known.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not all shadows are empty.